Well, I think it's safe to say that everyone is still reeling from Trump's win at the beginning of the month, but Bernie Sanders is already getting to work and he's thinking about what the left should do next. Now, there were a lot of solutions that were proposed in the aftermath of the 2016 election. For example, Cenk Uygur and Kyle Kulinski formed Justice Democrats, an organization that got progressives like AOC and Cori Bush elected to Congress. And also Bernie Sanders himself launched Our Revolution to pressure the Democratic Party with this inside-outside strategy. Now, while organizations like these gained prominence and they did make some progress, I think it's safe to say that it wasn't nearly sufficient. It didn't move the needle, and as a result, the Democratic Party hasn't changed in a meaningful way. The same neoliberal, pro-corporate structure is still intact. Weak and ineffectual people are still in leadership positions within the Democratic Party. Party elites are still as resistant to change now as they were the last time that Democrats got defeated by Donald Trump. For example, there's this race right now to elect a new DNC chair, and Rahm Emanuel is reportedly thinking of throwing his hat in the ring, which would be a terrible idea because he's not just a corporate Democrat. He's openly antagonistic towards the progressive wing of the party, which is basically half of the Democratic Party's base. But Rahm Emanuel isn't stepping up to help Democrats win elections. He's stepping up to stop progressives from taking over the party. The same thing happened back in 2017. So for the first time ever, the Democratic Party's base was actually engaged in the DNC chair race because they felt like change needed to happen in the aftermath of Hillary Clinton's loss to Donald Trump. So a lot of progressives were pushing for Keith Ellison, who was a Sanders ally. Now, during that time, Keith Ellison wasn't necessarily saying he's going to do a political revolution, but he was aligned with Bernie Sanders, and that scared the Democratic Party's establishment. And it was clear that he did want to take the party in a more grassroots, progressive direction and basically try to at least start to get them off the teat of corporate America. But once Ellison really started to gain momentum, Obama swooped in and made some calls to DNC members to lobby for Tom Perez, and guess what happened? We got Tom Perez. Keith Ellison lost, and then the party later voted against a ban on corporate cash, which is what the base really wanted. So the last decade has been really informative because it has confirmed that the Democratic Party, they don't want to change. They are refusing to change, and they've resisted change at every step of the way. So the best that we get is a Democratic Party that is not as bad as Republicans, which is important, sure, because I do believe in harm reduction, but it's not a great long-term strategy if you want to win, because it means Democrats will only win after enough Democrats become dissatisfied with Republicans, as Biden was able to do when Trump botched COVID. But the party has made it clear that they're not interested in long-term success because that would require them to build a progressive movement of working class people, which is something that they don't want to do because it conflicts with the interests of their corporate donors. I mean, think about it. We want Medicare for all, but their health industry donors don't, so they don't run on it. We want to raise the minimum wage, but their business industry donors don't. Now, they'll still run on that, but then when it's actually time to get that implemented, well, there's always this excuse: Manchin, Sinema, the parliamentarian. I mean, we want a new Glass-Steagall and regulations on Wall Street, but the Democratic Party's billionaire donors don't want that. So their plan for the foreseeable future is to simply coast to power whenever Republicans remind Americans how insane and destructive their policies are. And they're banking on that same thing again in 4 years after Trump inevitably fucks up, assuming he does step down. But I mean, this just means if they keep doing this, that we're going to go back and forth every 4 to 8 years with no real change while we continue to circle the drain as a country. What we need is an FDR-style leader who's going to fundamentally change the status quo. But when that type of leader emerged, the Democratic Party and their allies in media, they did everything that they could to sabotage him in that movement, proving multiple times that the Democratic Party just isn't a vehicle for transformative change, unfortunately. It used to be just that, but that is no longer the case. It is a different party. This is no longer FDR's party. So with all of that being said, Bernie Sanders is acknowledging this reality and asking some really important questions about what we do going forward. And Brent Walder shared this email from Bernie Sanders that he sent to supporters, and I'm going to read you just some of the highlights so we get a sense of what Bernie Sanders is thinking here. He writes, "The Democrats ran a campaign protecting the status quo and tinkering around the edges. Trump and the Republicans campaigned on change and on smashing the existing order. Not surprisingly, the Republicans won. Unfortunately, the change that Republicans will bring about will make a bad situation worse and a society of gross inequality even more unequal, more unjust, and more bigoted. Will the Democratic Party leadership learn the lessons of their defeat and create a party that stands with the working class and is prepared to take on the enormously powerful special interests that dominate our economy, our media, and our political life? Highly unlikely. They are too wedded to the billionaires and corporate interests that fund their campaigns. Given that reality, where do we go from here? That is the very serious question that needs a lot of discussion in the coming weeks and months. Now, he then asks how we expand our working class movement and defeat Citizens United, among other questions, given this reality now that we're all seeing that the Democratic Party isn't going to change. And he concludes saying, these are some of the political questions that together we need to address. And it is absolutely critical that you make your voice heard during this process. Not me, us. That is the only way forward. Now, he's not providing answers to the questions that he's asking, nor is he being specific about what he plans to do next. But a lot of people read this and they saw this as a sign that maybe this is Bernie Sanders toying with the idea of starting a new political party, since he's already tried his best to move Democrats in a more progressive, populist direction, and it simply just hasn't worked at all. It hasn't led to the transformative change that he's been pushing for that most people want. Sure, he's had some success, but for the most part, things are fundamentally the same. And people saw this email as him trying to gauge interest in the prospect of a brand new party. But I've got to say, I don't know if this is what he actually is hinting at, but if this were the case, it's very risky, and not just risky, it could backfire in so many ways. We risk disempowering ourselves since we have a majoritarian winner-take-all system, and worse, we risk splitting votes with liberals in the Democratic Party, which would then pave the way to even more Republican victories. So things could go bad quick with this. But having said that, on the other hand, this really does feel like a turning point in the country. And if the left doesn't make a big move right now, while we still can, we risk being purged from the Democratic Party altogether. This is what happened to the left in the UK. All of the Corbyn-supporting leftists and socialists were purged from the party by Keir Starmer's centrist neoliberal wing. And there's some people who kind of are hinting at doing the same, and some are just straight up saying that they want to do the same with the Democratic Party. Or at a minimum, just ignore the left until we all go away, because they believe that the left is ultimately responsible for Harris's defeat, even though she ran a conservative campaign that they all wanted her to run. But still, they're blaming us. For example, Jon Favreau, Obama alum turned podcast host, says Dems should resist any group or special interest that pressures them to take positions opposed by the electoral majority essential to win. I'm sure he's not talking about weapons to Israel here, which a majority of the country disapproves of. Anyways, he continues, whether that's big corporations, rich donors, nonprofits, whoever, this isn't about blaming specific groups for defeat. It's about what's required to win. Now, he's trying to dance around this, and he's not saying it explicitly, but the subtext is progressives, they should maybe not be listened to, and likely trans people as well, which is something that the party at large has been, quote, wrestling with, as this headline from The Hill points out. Although, to be fair, there has been some pushback to this. People like Jen Psaki, for example, has pushed back against this. But then there are others like Olivia Giuliana, a Gen Z surrogate for Democrats who endorsed the Democratic Party strategy to basically ice out independent media, since they're often critical of the party. Now, this was in response to people like Brian Tyler Cohen recommending that Democrats do more to build up independent media in the same way that Republicans have built up independent media. But these are just examples of some conversations taking place among prominent Democratic Party loyalists. But to be fair, these people in particular have very little influence on the direction of the party. But more influential folks who Democrats listen to, like Bill Maher, have made it very clear that he thinks that the woke identitarian left, pushed by progressives, they caused the party to die, basically, and they need to be purged. And Bill Clinton, a former Epstein associate who still has influence in the party for some reason, he is already pushing back on this idea that the establishment is the problem in the party, which suggests that it's the other faction that's the real problem. Let's listen now.
In demonizing all establishments and all people who wear a tie like you and me to work and have a good education, we are breaking down the legitimacy of not only people who may be too sanctimonious and too set in their ways in the past, but also people who actually know things that are very important for us today and very important for our continued growth and prosperity and harmony.
And that, my friends, is what we call gaslighting. When we talk about the establishment, we're not talking about people with white-collar jobs. He knows this. We're talking about the political establishment, political elites, the power brokers, the people with authority within the Democratic Party. And we've seen this same type of gaslighting before. Back when Bernie Sanders accused Hillary Clinton of being establishment, her response was, oh, well, I can't be establishment since I'm a woman. That's literally what she said, which is insane because she knows that he was referring to the political establishment that represents the status quo, but she played dumb to downplay the elitism of her and her ilk. But the Clintons, as well as the Obamas and other Democratic Party elites, collectively represent the establishment because they represent the donor class in the Democratic Party. They represent the neoliberal status quo that got us to this point where the working class feels as if the Democratic Party has abandoned them, right? And these Democrats, they abandoned the goals of the New Deal in favor of triangulation and, in favor of getting cozy with Wall Street and multinational corporations to the point where they're openly campaigning with billionaires and talking about how they're going to be friendly to big business. And that wing of the party is fundamentally at odds with the Bernie Sanders wing of the party, who simply thinks that the people should be represented as opposed to Wall Street and billionaires. Now, you may be thinking that it feels like this split in the party is going to lead to some sort of a civil war or some type of intra-party warfare. But that kind of already happened, and the left lost. We tried multiple times, and we lost. Bernie Sanders tried to take over the Democratic Party twice and couldn't do it. Grassroots organizations like Brand New Congress and Justice Democrats tried to do the same thing. They couldn't do it. Brand New Congress doesn't even exist anymore. More than 100 progressive candidates challenged establishment incumbent Democrats between 2018 and 2024, and almost all of them lost. I interviewed more than 100 on this program. All but like a couple of them got elected to Congress. So the left lost. And that is a reality that we have to deal with. And up until this point, the Democratic Party has tolerated us, but they've made it very clear that they don't want to have to deal with us anymore. We're kind of like a tick on their asses, and they would like to get rid of us so they can just campaign in the way that they want to, because they think that we're pushing them to the left and that's hurting them. Some of them are better than others at making the left feel at least welcome. Joe Biden, for example, not great, but he at least had a line of communication between progressives and himself, like Pramila Jayapal and Bernie Sanders. Kamala Harris, she chose Tim Walz as her running mate, to her credit, which is something that the left wanted, although she went on to disproportionately campaign for Republican votes in the last month of her campaign. But I mean, for the most part, the Democratic Party, collectively, they tolerate the left. But a lot of them feel like they don't want to do that anymore. And a lot of them are getting pretty vocal about this belief that they don't actually need the left to win. And because of that, we could witness an attempt to purge leftists from the party entirely. I mean, Labor did it, and they went on to win, and that kind of confirms their whole argument, oh, well, we don't need the left to win. And maybe Democrats are seeing that and thinking, what if we did the same thing? In fact, you can argue that that process to purge leftists from the Democratic Party has already begun since AIPAC ousted two of the most progressive members of Congress, Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, taking back these gains that we made with Justice Democrats. And the Democratic Party didn't even lift a finger to help them. In fact, they fought them getting into Congress, so of course they're going to stand back and let them get crushed by a special interest. I mean, they trotted out Hillary Clinton to endorse Eliot Engel when he was running against Jamal Bowman. They didn't want him in Congress, so they're happy to see him go. So all of this context is really important to understand why Bernie Sanders has arrived to this point where he's at now, where he's possibly thinking about forming a third party, because we've got to face the facts. The Democratic Party is a lost cause. And because he's come to this conclusion, maybe he is thinking that it's time to jump ship. Maybe we're reading too much into that email. I don't know. And I say that it's possible that we're reading too much into this because there was a lot of momentum for him to start a new party before, but he was against it because he knows about all of the risks. But if this were to happen, I want to game out some potential scenarios, because I think that it sounds good on paper, but when you actually think it through, you see that there's a lot of ways that this can go terribly wrong. But let's just hypothetically assume that Bernie Sanders did this and he announced a brand new party and it was called the Workers' Party. So here's some of the good and bad things that can happen. So let's say this happens. He announces the Workers' Party and then millions of people like that leave the Democratic Party to join Bernie's Workers' Party. Elected Democrats currently in Congress, the Progressive Caucus, Jayapal, AOC, they also leave and they join the Workers' Party. We could all have some wins in that incumbent Democrats, they just switch parties, so therefore we have a faction that represents this new party in Congress. But still, when it comes to actually winning elections, by doing this, we all could automatically be disenfranchising ourselves for the foreseeable future. And we wouldn't just lose elections in the short term. We would give the Democratic Party exactly what they want, a party with no progressives. So in a way, by leaving the party, that's exactly what a lot of Democrats want. They would be happier without us. Now, the reason why I say we'd be automatically disenfranchising ourselves is because Duverger's law, that is a real thing. And it means that if you have a majoritarian winner-take-all electoral system, you are always going to have just two viable political parties. Our system was built to reinforce the existence of just two parties, meaning that Bernie's Worker Party could be about as irrelevant as the Libertarian Party or the Green Party as soon as it launches. Even though he's a huge figure, he has an uphill battle to climb with this new party should he create one. And people don't know this, but we already have hundreds of parties in the country at the state and federal level. And the problem isn't necessarily that we don't have other parties besides Democrats and Republicans that actually do represent the interests of workers. We have them. The problem is that those parties can't win because of the electoral system itself, which disenfranchises any politician that isn't part of that two-party duopoly. It's why socialists and leftists begrudgingly vote for and run as Democrats, because they know that the system itself is literally rigged against all parties except Democrats and Republicans. Now, that's not to say that you can't change the system and get electoral reform, but that's really, really hard. We had ranked choice voting on the ballot in my state of Oregon this year, and it failed overwhelmingly. That would pave the way to potentially getting more parties, at least in the state of Oregon, perhaps, but people view that as overly complicated, and real electoral reform, where we switch to proportional from majoritarian, that's even more confusing to people. So that's tough to do. But even if you got electoral reform or you got ranked choice voting nationwide, it doesn't automatically mean that a new party would be viable overnight. These types of things take time, and as much as I hate to say it, as many people that identify as independent, we've got to acknowledge that Democrats and Republicans are culturally embedded in politics, so there is a sizable portion of people that will just automatically vote Democrat no matter what, even if they see this new option that is more viable than other third parties. Now, even if Bernie's new third party hit 5% in the first election, and they got federal matching funds, that's not a path to long-term viability. We know this because Ross Perot, he did that with his Reform Party. They hit 5% and then they died. I mean, ask yourself, how many members of the Reform Party are in Congress today? 0, because the party is fucking dead. So starting from scratch is an uphill battle, which is why Bernie Sanders has resisted people who said he should start a new party, right? This is why he's opted to try to influence the Democratic Party instead, because even though that's difficult, if not near impossible, it can happen. Trump proved that it can happen. Trump basically took over the Republican Party and remade it in his own image, in the same way that Bernie Sanders wanted to remake the Democratic Party in a more progressive, worker-friendly image. But again, Bernie tried twice and failed. Candidates across the country have tried to enter the party and take it over, and they failed. So if we were to start a new party, Bernie might be successful at getting people to join and at pressuring the Democratic Party into maybe shifting left a little bit, at least aesthetically, if they felt like they could lose votes to this new worker party. But even in that more optimistic scenario where Bernie's new party has influence, the problem is you then risk splitting votes, which helps Republicans. And if the fascists win, then nobody has power, not leftists, not liberals. And if Democrats collaborate with the Workers' Party to avoid that scenario where we see vote splitting, you then risk co-optation, because the Democratic Party will be much stronger than some new political party created by Bernie Sanders. So a likely scenario would be that the Democratic Party ultimately absorbs the Workers' Party in the same way that Republicans co-opted and ultimately absorbed the Tea Party movement. and then we're all back to square one, right? So if you can't tell, I'm not very optimistic about the chances of a new party being successful because there's so much that could go wrong and there's so much that could backfire. And we could ultimately give Democrats what they want in leaving the party. But is there a possibility that Bernie forms a new party and it could go right? Maybe. And I say this because there used to be two different parties in the United States. There was the Democratic Party and there was the Whigs. But the Whigs are no longer around because they died. They were replaced by the Republican Party after the Whigs fractured in the 1800s. So while Duverger's law does prevent a third party from being politically viable, it doesn't stop a new party from replacing an old party. There will always be two parties, but what two parties? That is something that can change, and this has happened before. So Dave Roos of History explains, the Whigs were a loose coalition of diverse political interests, anti-Masons, national Republicans, disillusioned Democrats, united by a shared hatred of President Andrew Jackson. To the Whigs, Jackson was King Andrew I, a despot who usurped power from Congress to serve his own populist ideals. The Jacksonian Democrats painted the Whigs as a party of wealthy northern elites who wanted to sidestep the will of the people, but the Whigs actually defied a singular identity. There were Protestant moral reformers who wanted to pass prohibition laws aimed at Catholic immigrants. There were defenders of Native Americans angered at Jackson's relocation orders that led to the infamous Trail of Tears. And while there was a strong anti-slavery sentiment among some Whigs, it wasn't an abolitionist party. Like the Democratic Party before the Civil War, the Whigs were a bisectional party that drew voters from both the North and South, explains Philip Wallach, a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Quote, both parties, therefore, had an interest in keeping slavery off the national agenda as much as possible, says Wallach. But in the case of the Whig Party, it just couldn't find any way of dealing with the slavery issue that would satisfy both its northern and southern wings. The divisive slavery issue came to a head again in 1854 with the passing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which authorized new territories and states to decide for themselves if they wanted to allow slavery. Anti-slavery Whigs, deciding that their party wasn't sufficiently committed to halting the spread of slavery, splintered off and formed the Republican Party along with anti-slavery Democrats. Among the former prominent Whigs who turned Republican were Thaddeus Stevens, William Seward, and Abraham Lincoln. So the Whigs died out and were eventually replaced by the Republican Party because they had become too factionalized and had irreconcilable differences. And Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party rose from the ashes of the Whigs. So the question is, can Bernie Sanders' new Worker Party ultimately replace the Democratic Party in the same way that Lincoln's Republicans replaced the Whigs? Can a workers' party led by Bernie rise from the ashes of the Democratic Party? I mean, the context obviously is very different, but there were certainly parallels between then and now, right? There's a lot of factionalization within the Democratic Party across multiple lines. Democrats view themselves as a big tent, and they pretend as if that's a good thing, but that is kind of the problem. Like, this big of a coalition, it can't include people with conflicting interests, right? What some Democrats want are fundamentally at odds with what other Democrats want. And that is a problem for the party. A party that's big enough to include both neocons and imperialists, trans people and transphobes, progressives and conservatives, pro-Palestinian people and pro-Israel genocide supporters, that is not a stable coalition. That is not a winning coalition. And we saw how that worked out for the Whigs. Today's Democratic Party is largely held together by a Republican common enemy, but as both of Trump's wins taught us, mutual hate for Republicans simply isn't enough to maintain a party. You need to have a core ideology with real goals, as Democrats once did when FDR was president. But the question is, can Bernie Sanders create a new party that actually forces realignment in some way where conservative Democrats no longer feel welcome and they flee to the Republicans, and then you have center-left and left-wing people create this new type of party, and the new two parties look different? I mean, it's possible. And in this anti-establishment era that we're all in, I'd say that the window for that type of event might be open now more than ever, because we are in an era where people are very dissatisfied with the status quo. It's why they're voting for fascism. That doesn't excuse it or justify it, but when you become so desperate, you become susceptible to radicalization. Society starts to devolve. People become, entangled with these bizarre conspiracy theories because they're trying to find some way to ease the pain. So, I don't know if Bernie Sanders could pull something like that off, because now is very different than the 1800s. The issues were different, and also we have to contend with social media, that type of misinformation and propaganda that might be able to stop this sort of thing before it even gets off the ground. We live in an era where billionaires control media. They buy media companies. Elon Musk is floating the idea of buying MSNBC. So they're not just going to sit idly by while an anti-capitalist workers' party emerges. No, they're going to crush it. Just ask Occupy Wall Street where the movement is now. It's dead. It was crushed by capitalist forces, right? The elites are going to do everything that they can do to stop it. So it's a huge risk. And I'd say the chance of success for a new workers' party led by Bernie Sanders is very, very low, if I'm being honest. But the question is, will Bernie do it? And I don't know. But the questions he's asking are important, and I'm glad that somebody's asking these questions. And I do think that it's important that we think big and think outside the box. Because if we ever want to save ourselves from the fascist death spiral that we're currently in, you can't just do the same thing and expect different results. Democrats might win in 4 years if Trump chooses to cede power, but if Gavin Newsom happens to get elected, that's not going to fundamentally change the country or whatever neoliberal corporate hack that, the Democratic Party puts up. It's just going to be Republican, Democrat as things continue to get progressively worse. So I'm skeptical that Bernie would be able to pull this off. With that being said, if he were to do something like this, I would be one of the first people to sign up. I don't think it would do much, but I would at least give it a try because, how can you not in this day and age? We're going up against major forces. This is truly a David versus Goliath situation. And unlike the actual tale of David v. Goliath, I think that Goliath would crush us. But having said that, though, I think that any grassroots momentum that could lead to change or at least pressure the elites to change, even if it's a little bit, I think it's worth pursuing at this point in time, because what have we got to lose? Things are as bad as they can be. So if Bernie Sanders were to do this, yeah, I'd say, hell, I'll join. Probably it's not going to work, might backfire, but I'll try it out. But that's if he does something like this. I'm skeptical. I think people might actually be reading too much into this. But with that being said, we'll have to wait and see. If anyone could do it, it's Bernie.